Hello and welcome to this evening's VPAL signature event. Harvard Speaks on Climate Change, Climate Politics, and the Energy Transition is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning and the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability in partnership with the Harvard Alumni Association. The Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability presents Harvard Speaks on Climate Change, a new series featuring Harvard faculty working on different dimensions of the climate challenge. In this session, Professors Dustin Tingley and Gordon Hanson will explore the political, economic, and social challenges surrounding the energy transition. Professor and Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, Jim Stock, will host. Without further ado, Jim, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks so much and welcome. I'm Jim Stock. I'm Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, Director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, and an economist in the Economics Department and the Kennedy School. Harvard has many faculty who are on the forefront of all aspects of climate and sustainability. This series highlights their work. It's a virtual tour of Harvard's laboratories and research institutes. Today's topic is central to the vast transition to clean energy that we're just starting. The effect of this transition on local communities, especially those that have historically produced or relied heavily upon fossil fuels to drive their economies. For those communities, the energy transition will mean lost jobs and economic change. The challenge is how those communities and workers can be treated equitably and ideally gain from the transition. We're fortunate tonight to have two guests, one a political scientist, the other an economist, who have thought deeply about this issue from different angles. Dustin Tingley is a professor in the government department and in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Dustin has worked on multiple topics, including the politics of climate change and international relations. He recently completed a book, Uncertain Futures, jointly with Alexander Ghazmararian, a graduate student at Princeton. The book provides a constructive vision of how to move forward on some of the most challenging problems of the energy transition, and I highly recommend it. Gordon Hanson is a Peter Wertheim Professor in Urban Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Gordon's work is focused on the effects of international trade on local communities and jobs. Recently, he has been focusing on what lessons can be learned for the energy transition about what have largely been policy failures in our response to recent major disruptions, such as the rise of Chinese manufacturing and the decline in coal jobs. Dustin will lead off for 15 minutes, then Gordon, then open discussion. I'll select or combine questions from the Q&A stream and ask them to our guests. With that, let me turn this over to Dustin.
Thanks so much, Jim. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm going to briefly run through some of the themes that come out of this book and turn it over to my colleague who has a lot of insights to offer as well. And we're really looking forward to the conversation with all of you. So as Jim mentioned, this is a joint project with Alexander Ghazmararian, who's down at Princeton. So in our view, the energy transition confronts a real political economy challenge. This is a big one, folks. How do we simultaneously think about phasing out fossil fuels while building out another huge additional economy? Our world runs on energy, not Dunkin' Donuts, or some of you run on Dunkin' Donuts. But we run on energy, and to make this transition, it's going to be hard. But the reform strategies around this face political challenges. There are all these new industrial policies, the Inflation Reduction Act. And some of this involves strategies for compensation, investment, retraining. But communities will resist this compensation. Richard Trumko, a union boss, will never trust another promise. There's local opposition to investments, and there are workforce shortages, so people not going into some of these sectors. And so what this book does is it provides very much a ground-up perspective that entailed going out and talking to folks, being on the ground, surveying people in these types of communities that were producing fossil fuels to think about how are they thinking about this energy transition. And when we went out and did this, there were a couple of themes that came out for why is there this impasse? Why is there such reluctance? That were very interesting and were not the sorts of things that were just sort of climate change denial or these folks just aren't educated or something, because that just was not the case. That exists, but that was, not a first order thing that we observed. And there were two things. One was what we call a credible commitment problem. I'll talk about what that is. And the second was a local economic opportunity argument that we heard, and I'll talk about that as well. So let's talk about the credibility challenge here. So the credibility challenge comes along when anytime a government says, hey, we're going to do this for you in the future, right? We're going to set up a compensation scheme that might retrain you to go into a new line of work, or going to funnel resources into your community to help you get through and transition to a new place, a new economy. A great example of the challenge of this, though, is that in the future, the government might change, or even if it's the same government, their priorities might change, or maybe even the macroeconomic context itself has changed. It makes it really hard to actually follow through with those policies. Trade adjustment assistance was something that our country had in place to help workers who were put out of work due to international trade. The Reagan administration came in and gutted the program. There's also just broader things about communities and people just not having the trust basis that we might want to really see us through this transition. So there's a whole host of what we call credibility challenges, and there's a history of this. In 1990, there was the Clean Air Act amendments say we're going to phase out high sulfur coal because high sulfur coal is something that is causing acid rain. Those of you old enough to remember that, this is a really big issue. This was incredibly successful environmental legislation, but it almost didn't pass. And it almost didn't pass because Senator Byrd from West Virginia said, hey, I want to have as part of this transitional support for high sulfur coal workers. That transitional support was actually defeated. I'm not going to tell you who was the last person to vote against it. It's someone that you know about and hear about in the news an awful lot today. Got to read the book. But it was defeated, and only a sliver of the assistance was in the final bill. And 3 years later, that assistance itself wasn't reauthorized. And the communities that we're talking about here have been decimated, not just because of this policy, a range of other things, automation, the rise of natural gas, but this was a part of it. And the transition assistance didn't come through. And so this is a cartoon from the United Mine Workers Archives from their journal, kind of summing up the feeling of coal workers at this point in time. Now, one of the things that we went out and did is we went and said, hey, we want to measure some of these perceptions of credibility problems. And so this is a picture of Alex, who was going around to county fairs out in Appalachia to run surveys. So, doing surveys of people in these communities. We also surveyed local policymakers throughout the country, youths, as well as union members. To give you a sense of the mechanics behind this research, I mean, that's something that, Vice Provost Stock really wants to articulate. One of the things we had to do is we had to figure out where are we going to sample. So on the left-hand side, these were a sampling frame that we used for local policymakers. So think like a local economic development official, a mayor in the country. And these are areas that had high amounts of fossil fuel production. On the right-hand side is another sample we did that was more just of populations, but was sampling on areas that had high amounts of fossil fuel and fossil fuel related activity. So this included things like automotive sectors as well. So really trying hard to reach different types of communities rather than just saying we're going to run a national sample. And that national sample is basically a weighted combination of California, Texas, and New York, for example. So we would ask questions like this. Consider a promise by the federal government to make a 10-year investment in economic development in your area. Do you think the government would be likely to reduce it, keep the same, or expand it? And one of the things you see is that just a lot of concern about whether would be likely to, the government would be likely to reverse course and in fact reduce the investment in the future. The second theme that comes out in the book is around local economic opportunity. All right, and some of this boils down to, are there going to be good jobs in this new clean energy economy? One of the jokes is around, what is maintenance on a solar field? Maintenance on a solar field is a weed whacker and some Windex. Now, some of this comes down to the different capital versus labor intensity of these types of jobs, but also comes down to, what sort of, how labor intensive does it need to be given the type of industry that you're in? One person told us that, the whole reason a coal-fired power plant employs so many people is precisely because it's dirty. And then it makes us think about, where are the, geographically, where are the skill mismatch is going to be. And my colleague, Professor Hansen, is going to talk a little bit more about this. But this real local economic opportunity challenge came up again and again and again in our interviews. And so one of the things we did is we went out and we ran national and regional surveys to look at, perceptions. Are jobs going to locals? Will the industry go in the future? Will they be temporary jobs? And what will be the pay of green industries? And asking their people their feelings on that. We also got access to some survey data from a middle school system in Southwest Pennsylvania that asked them, what are the sorts of careers that you're interested in going into? And it was a revealing light about how this younger community was seeing things. Now, we didn't stop at just saying there are problems, right? Everyone's got a problem. We wanted to do is try to think about how could we enhance the credibility of this transition as seen by these communities. And we laid out a set of 7 solutions. You've got to read the book to understand what these exactly are and how they work. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So one is around creating opportunity with transparency. And there's a whole literature here that talks about the role of transparency here, and some of it about how it can enhance the credibility of commitments, in part because you can clarify and identify when promises are actually broken. It's also something that can enhance perceptions of local economic opportunity because it alters the incentives of governments and firms. And the particular application that we worked on here was about local jobs. Are these jobs in these new industries, wind, solar, et cetera, going to go to local workers, or are they going to go elsewhere? This is a picture that a union in Minnesota gave us, where they would literally go around and take pictures of the parking lots where workers working on a wind installation site would park, and they would count up the number of license plates that were out of state. And it became this rallying call. People would just always talk about, like, oh, the out-of-state license plates. You got to look at the license plates. And it was because of this concern that the jobs were going to locals. That same union gave us some data that said, these workers, they represented both the clean energy sector and fossil sector. And they surveyed people, and they said, hey, if the jobs would go to local workers, would you be in support of this energy transition? And those union members would say, yeah, absolutely. If it goes to local workers, we're going to be way more supportive of this transition than not. And so the union actually fought for a local reporting requirement that just said, hey, you've got to report the number of locals that are employed in your project. And it transformed the debate of communities in this region around some of these things. We also then use something called a survey experiment. So the idea here is we're going to ask you a question, but then we're going to randomly manipulate part of that question and see what effect that has on different outcomes. And here we said the government will, or some people said will not require companies provide public reports on how many jobs would go to local workers. And then we asked about different outcomes, different perceptions of that, doing this with both a national survey, but also in a survey of local policymakers. And the other thing that we did was also explored another mechanism beyond transparency, which is different routes to create credibility, such as community input or the insulation of funding. Right? So community input consultation helps create better reputations. Communities can anticipate the decisions, will reflect their preferences. Now, it could create a trade-off with government commitment, right? If the community is dictating everything, the government doesn't have a say in anything, the government might not want to stick around. And this is an important point. There will be trade-offs. There will absolutely be trade-offs in all of this. Another mechanism is, how do we insulate funding such that it improves perceptions of government commitment? Insulated funding is more likely to last, to be there off into the future. And so again, we used an experimental setup where we asked about here, imagine an environmental policy. It's going to create layoffs at a major local employer, but there's going to be a program to retrain workers and make community investments. And that program was described in terms of having elements of community input and long-term funding. That's our treatment condition, and a control condition. And all of these things were randomized, right? And so, what are sort of the things that you can uncover? You can uncover by having community input. What you can see is you actually build support for energy transition policies. The downside is it maybe creates a suspicion, oh, the government might cut us off a little bit. So that's that trade-off I was talking about before. Insulating funding can increase some things, especially perceptions of policy program durability. So again, these are just mechanisms that we as social scientists can use to understand if we design programs in particular ways, what will be the impacts on what people think and perceive could happen. Again, just to surface, a lot of this book is about collecting ground up evidence from the communities that we worked with. Ranges of things, surveys, survey experiments, looking at the national public, local officials, unions, a bunch of surveys we did with youths because they're going to be that sort of workforce of that future. We did loads of interviews, communities, local and national officials, union leaders, firms. And, part of the reason we did this was it could be so tempting to think that we sort of knew what the solutions were as well as the problems, and then we're going to go off and we're going to be academics. But it was really important to let them articulate things as they are seeing them, which then opens up the possibility that we can design things that would be actually helpful. And finally, we did a bunch of case studies looking at memoirs and the United Mine Workers archives. And so at the end of the day, if this transition is going to happen, and if it's going to be supported through policies, it's got to be policies that are credible, because more credible policies build support for the energy transition. Thank you very much. This is some information about the book, and I'll pause there and pass it over to my colleague.
Thanks very much, Dustin. What Dustin has done is to lay out for you the political challenges in convincing people that the energy transition is a transition we actually want to undertake. What I'd like to highlight for you are some of the economic challenges in conducting that transition in a way that is not enormously disruptive for folks who are currently deriving their livelihoods from fossil fuels. I'm doing this work as part of a larger project called Reimagining the Economy at Harvard Kennedy School, in which we're looking at solutions to help regions that have suffered long-term economic distress, usually manifesting in the form of high rates of joblessness that just don't go away even after years of time for adjustment. To frame the challenge, I want to show you a map of the places in which people with fossil fuel jobs have those jobs. So a couple of things. What are these units you're seeing on the maps? These represent what economists think of as local labor markets, collections of counties in which people live and work. Because, as it turns out, people don't move that often between places, even in the aftermath of losing a job, local labor markets are really relevant for understanding your material well-being. When there's a jobs boom in your place, you're likely to see economic benefits, either directly, more people buying goods at your store or buying meals in your restaurant, or indirectly in terms of rising property prices. When there's an economic downturn, likewise, you're going to take some of that pain yourself as a consequence of deteriorating economic conditions. So that's what the units are in this map. What do the colors mean? The colors are showing us where 3 types of jobs are located in the US. And these are jobs related to fossil fuels, either directly or indirectly. In total, somewhere between kind of 1.5 and 2 million jobs that are really directly tied to fossil fuels. About 750 to 800,000 of those jobs are in the extraction and refining of coal, oil, and gas. So another 200,000 jobs in coal and gas-fired electrical utilities that then generate power from fossil fuels. And there's another 750,000 to 850,000 jobs in heavy industry, which uses so much energy that those manufacturing plants tend to locate right near fuel sources. So what you can see as you look across the map is that these jobs aren't spread smoothly across the United States. They're clustered in particular places. And they're clustered, much of this clustering is where the oil, gas, or coal are located. If you look at the legend in the lower right-hand corner, what this shows you is the share of total employment in these locations that are in fossil fuel-related activities. And you see that darkest red and then lighter red have at least around 6% of total employment in fossil fuel jobs. Suppose these fossil fuel jobs were to go away in the space of 5 or 10 years, losing employment that's equivalent to 6% of your working age population in that short of a time frame is catastrophic. It would be the equivalent of a local Great Depression for these places. So our challenge is figuring out how do we get people who are specialized in fossil fuel related activities today to switch into something new as we undertake the energy transition. The proposal that the Biden administration has put on the table through the Inflation Reduction Act is to try and move people into green jobs. So you're producing energy from fossil fuels, let's produce energy from wind, solar, and other renewable sources. As Dustin laid out, there's just a numbers problem here. Fossil fuel related energy extraction and energy production are a lot more labor intensive than equivalent energy generation is with regards to renewables. So what that means is we're going to have to find something new for these folks to do. And I'm going to just spend the next couple of minutes telling you about the challenges in that process. So just to think immediately, though, about, well, would there be green jobs in the locations where these folks are currently working? You can look at a map on the left of solar power generating potential, and then on the right of wind power generating potential. And what you see is that some of the places, in particular the mining and fracking communities in Wyoming, in parts of Montana, in North Dakota, they aren't, and also in parts of West Texas and southeastern New Mexico, they aren't terribly positioned to undergo the energy transition. But going back to the map, you got a lot of places in the Southeast and in the Midwest and in the Northeast where the renewable potential is low. So we're going to have to find non-energy related activities for these folks, jobs for these folks to take up. Now, the concerning thing here is that our record in dealing with the energy transition to date isn't great. We have sort of a preview of this in terms of what's happened in the coal mining industry. On the left is a map of the total employment in coal mining going back to 1970. You see that the 1970s were just a boom time for coal mining. The price of oil was spiking because of the multiple oil price shocks that occurred during that decade. Demand for coal went up as a consequence, and employment in coal mining hit at its peak around 240,000 jobs. Over the next couple of decades, what happened? Well, the oil price went up, and then the oil price went down. And as the oil price fell, the price of coal fell, and demand for coal mining went through the floor. And that 240,000 jobs in 1980 turned into about 70,000 jobs by the early 2000s. Then we had the round two of trauma for the coal mining industry, and that was a consequence of the fracking revolution. All of a sudden, we figured out new ways of extracting natural gas from existing energy fields that put further downward pressure on the price of gas and therefore the price of coal. And employment in coal mining went from around 80,000 jobs in 2010 to around 40,000 jobs today. Those coal mining communities, as you'll see on the right, had a really hard time adjusting. What the figure on the right shows is the ratio of per capita income in counties that were specialized in coal mining relative to per capita income in the United States as a whole. So at its peak, when coal prices were high in the late 1970s, average incomes in coal country were over 75% of what they were in the rest of the United States, well below 100%. Coal country was poor to begin with. But as those coal jobs disappeared, what happened to relative incomes in coal country relative to the rest of the United States was just a period of steady declines. Incomes in coal country fell relative to the rest of the country by a full 10 percentage points just in the 1980s, and they had a further decline after the fracking revolution in 2010. This process through which job loss that happens in pretty short order begets long-run stagnation and economic distress is not unique to coal mining. we've seen this more generally with the decline of manufacturing jobs, due in part to globalization. I've spent a lot of the last 10 years studying the impact of increased import competition from China on local labor markets in the United States. But and then the loss of manufacturing jobs to technological change and just other broader secular changes in the economy. What this means is that we've seen places that take a hit, suffer adverse shocks to their key industries, can have a hard time adjusting to do something different. So what I'd like to walk you through for the remaining couple of minutes here is just what are our options to help places that are in a situation of economic distress as a consequence of concentrated job loss. The energy transition is going to create that job loss, but it's by no means the only source of job loss that we might want to be concerned about. So what are the policy options here? Well, one option is just to let market forces work. That is when wages fall, when unemployment increases, that's a signal either for firms to come in and avail themselves of the low wages on offer in places that have suffered joblessness. As an aside, that almost never happens. Firms are not attracted to places with high unemployment. An alternative is for folks to realize the jobs are gone, they're not coming back, let's just move. There are workers who are mobile in response to those sorts of market signals. They're primarily young, and they're primarily college educated or have the potential of getting a college education. If you're over 40 and you don't have a college degree, you're not very likely to move from one local labor market to another, even in the presence of a substantial decline in economic activity. Option two is to rely on the social safety net. Use unemployment insurance, use food stamps, use other sorts of means-tested entitlement programs to help push up the incomes of folks who've been hurt by job loss or other sources of disruption. Problem here is that by design, most safety net policies are temporary. You're going to prop up your incomes for a bit, but most of them will phase out within 1 to 5 years. And with many forms of federal welfare support, there's a lifetime of 5 years for which you could draw on benefits. The other challenge with the social safety net is that it doesn't really hit at one of the key challenges that places that have suffered job loss have experienced, and that is the thing they used to be good at, it now doesn't work for them. They have to find something new. Providing unemployment insurance or providing Medicaid or providing food stamps is not going to help regions find that something new. As a consequence, economists have kind of slowly come back around to take place-based policy more seriously. I think for decades, there was a lot of skepticism about place-based policy because it was targeting the wrong thing. If the thing we're concerned about is joblessness and people not having jobs, then we should be targeting jobless workers. Why should we target the zip codes in which those jobless workers lived? What we've discovered is that often the most effective way of turning places around is trying to change not just the outcomes for a household in which the prime income earner lost their, say, job in coal mining. It's really trying to change the overall labor market equilibrium in a region. And that requires more than just helping poor households. So what do these sorts of place-based policies look like? They come in kind of 4 different flavors. One is the policy domain you're probably most familiar with and you think of first when it comes to place-based policy, and that's using tax incentives to attract firms to come and locate in a place. Governors love tax incentives. That's because tax incentives give you a ribbon cutting. You get to show that you, during your administration, attracted some big factory to come locate in your county, and that ribbon cutting pays off for you at the ballot box. And there's some great work by political scientists showing that that is in fact the case. That said, as in practice, business recruitment has issues. Most firms, as I mentioned earlier, don't necessarily want to go to places with high unemployment. It's hard to get Amazon, when it was thinking about where to put its new headquarters, to think about places with high joblessness in Southern Ohio or in West Virginia. They wanted to be in big, expensive superstar cities. Flavor two is workforce development, where we're trying to expand the supply of human capital in a place. And when I say human capital or workforce development, you might immediately think of college education. And that's not what folks have in mind. The margin that matters for trying to build skills in a place typically it involves career and technical education. That is targeted training that most people get at a local community college that teaches you how to be a master welder, teaches you techniques in advanced manufacturing, how to be a radiology lab technician, how to get a commercial driver's license. These programs are 12 to 24 months in length. They work really well in terms of increasing people's earnings. The challenge is helping community colleges figure out what programs should they be offering, helping prospective trainees figure out what programs they should take up, and then convincing firms that the skills that these community colleges are providing in fact work. I'll say more about that in just a second. Flavor three is urban redevelopment, tax credits for investing in low-income communities. Donald Trump's opportunity zones are an example of this. In practice, these have been tried at a pretty small scale, not more than a couple $2 billion a year. And finally, helping small business develop. And here the approach is not to try and bring in trophy firms from somewhere, but helping local firms expand. So to kind of set us up for the Q&A, I want to highlight what we're doing on these domains at the current moment in time. And I'm going to focus on just two of these. One is business recruitment and the other is workforce development. On the left, I'm showing you the magnitude of funds that go into business recruitment. It's around $30 to $40 billion a year. And if the point of this was to help places with high joblessness then turn themselves around and find their new industry of specialization, these sorts of tax incentives would concentrate in places with high joblessness. I show you in the graph on the right the correlation between these tax incentives and the employment rates in different commuting zones in the United States in a bin scatter, and what you see is a flat red line indicating zero correlation. We aren't using tax incentives to attract firms to places with high joblessness. Workforce development, money that states and communities and the federal government pays for career and technical education, does a much better job of targeting places with high joblessness. You see a downward sloping red line on the right. That means that most funding goes to places with low employment rates, indicating better targeting than is the case with tax incentives. And we're spending about the same amount of money annually on workforce development and through career and technical education as we are with tax incentives. So what we've learned is that job loss can be painful. We have a lot of policies in place. The question isn't so much the amount of money that we're dedicating to the issue, it's how we're spending that money, and available evidence suggests we could be doing a much better job. Thanks very much. Really looking forward to Q&A. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Jim.
Thanks. Those were great presentations. There's just so many questions to ask. I think that I will take moderator's prerogative here and just jump in with one. And it seems like an obvious tension, and I would love to have both of you respond to this, an obvious tension between these two approaches, between the two sets of research, I should say, is thinking about this all-in approach, or maybe a sort of modified all-in approach on place-based policies that Gordon you're describing, and then thinking about that in light of Dustin's credibility comments. And are some of these place-based policies going to be more credible and durable and acceptable than others? Is this actually a way to get around some of the credibility problems of the older programs? If you could just discuss that, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot first and then pass it to Gordon. I think it's highly complementary. And here's why. You can go back to the discussion I said about, sort of community consultation, which one of the mechanisms there is like, hey, what should we invest in your community, right? And that was something that really can drive a lot of support. Now, how the government does that, what the optimal economic way to do those more place-based things. But these are communities that they're real communities. So they're not just places, right? There's an additional layer to that. There are churches, there are civic organizations, there are YMCAs, there's the local football team. All of these things give a sort of a sense of collective identity and collective optimism. And in some of my earlier work, I actually showed that people in these fossil fuel communities, if you give them a choice between people-based things like funds to target an individual who's out of work versus a place-based investment policy where you use the same amount of funds, but it targets the sort of the broader community as a whole, they actually preferred the community-based mechanism at a higher rate than the national public, right? And so they have this deep appreciation of, if you're investing in community, it's a longer term type investment that you're trying. Now, there are downsides. Like, what happens if that's a more expensive thing to do, a more expensive proposition, et cetera? So there are trade-offs, but I do think that place-based policies are squarely a way to solve, and we talk about it in the book, are a mechanism to solve some of the credibility issues. The question is, how do you do it and how do you target? And that's the sort of thing that Gordon and his colleagues are doing amazing work on.
So just picking up on Dustin's point there in terms of the credibility, when we think about place-based policy, we often have in mind the idea that this is something the federal government does, it's command and control, they're orchestrating everything, and they've got to have the solutions in mind. In practice, most of the solutions, most of the strategizing, the ideas actually come from the local level. The federal government puts money into the system, but it usually doesn't come knock on your door and say, here it is. You have to go get it. And getting it means creating the right type of local intermediaries. A community development financial institution to get certain types of tax breaks, a small business development center to get funding for technical assistance to business, or career and technical education programs within your community college. So what that means is that the orchestrators and the innovators and the experimenters when it comes to place-based policy are people who are running those organizations on the ground. What they will tell you, and these are many of these folks I met after reading Dustin's work on economic development in southwestern Pennsylvania, they'll tell you that working with the federal government is incredibly hard. The scale is wrong. The intermittency of funding is off. The bureaucratic requirements are onerous. And so the reason some of that funding doesn't go to the right place is that the most distressed places don't have the wherewithal, the local capacity to avail themselves of that funding. So the ideas and the action will come locally. We've got to make it easier for that to happen.
One point that you were making, Gordon, I think in the maps of the location of wind and solar, I believe those are your maps, the location of wind and solar versus location of job losses, not necessarily the location of fossil fuel facilities, not really lining up, other than perhaps in Texas. There is another aspect of the Inflation Reduction Act that has to do with manufacturing subsidies and then requirements for battery assembly and manufacturing in the United States for tax credit eligibility, and also EV assembly. And we're seeing a lot of plants being built now, EV assembly plants, battery facilities, and so forth being built, and some PV photovoltaic manufacturing facilities being built. How does that square with your sort of approach towards place-based? I mean, are these actually lining up? Certainly a lot of that is happening in places like Georgia, North Carolina, and Ohio. How does that line up with your, with your place-based policies, or is that actually more of a miss in the sense that you had that chart that showed the low correlation between the tax credit, tax subsidy approach and where the actual job losses are?
Yeah, there is the Inflation Reduction Act did have a place-based component to it. It really intended, it has one of its objectives to try and reduce economic distress regionally. The challenge is you've got to get companies who want to go to the places that the government wants them to go. And the challenge that companies face is they need the workers. So the parts of Georgia that have succeeded in building battery factories are ones in which they've engaged local community colleges to provide excellent training in the advanced manufacturing techniques you need in a battery facility. Now, those turn out not to be the counties in Georgia with high joblessness. They're counties that had their act together to begin with, and they were well positioned to take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act provisions. Now, that's not to say there's anything wrong with what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing. We want to be expanding battery production, and you don't want to saddle battery production with the additional burden of trying to reduce unemployment in other places. But just to highlight the fact that we shouldn't expect the Inflation Reduction Act to provide a twofer. It'd be great if it gets us to expand battery production, but it's reducing joblessness in distressed places that I'd be more suspicious of.
And I think just to build off that point, some of, for example, the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act would give you additional tax incentives if you met other criteria, right? So for example, if there had been recent declines and closures in coal facilities, for example. So you get a sort of a bump up. But there are, a couple questions there. Like, was that a sufficient bump up? You're not seeing tons of investment going into those places. And a couple of firms keep getting held up as examples. And I'm very thankful that that's happening. But that's like that's a hard thing to set. Like, how much of an incentive do you need to do to overwhelm the otherwise perhaps deterrent effects that not having that skilled workforce in place for those industries? Because these things take time. And I think that's something that many folks don't recognize. What Gordon said was those community colleges in those places in Georgia, they had their act together and they'd been doing some of these things for a while. And why was that? Well, there had been an automotive sector in some of those regions already. So this isn't a like snap your fingers and all of a sudden you can set up a robust training program in wind energy all of a sudden. We interviewed as part of the book the main wind energy instructor in West Virginia, who basically said, it's only me. My students have to drive 3 hours to get here often, and they have families. That's not a strategy, right? And so, I think like we just have to embrace the fact that there are going to be challenges like that. And it just really goes back to a point that Gordon made about capacity that just, he invited me to this workshop that he ran where I got to meet with some of the officials that they invited up. And the capacity thing is just huge. But it's also an opportunity. I've got to say, in my conversations with the White House, I know Gordon's talking to folks. That is something that there can be more to be done in that capacity building area. And there are tweaks that can happen. So it's going to be a hard one, but I'm optimistic that there are mechanisms that we can start to overcome these things. But you can't expect overnight economic transformations of entire regions.
It seems that companies working closely with the community colleges is certainly an important part of it, as Gordon, you suggested, is happening in the battery plant area. That was actually something that really happened in a big way in southwestern Pennsylvania during the early days of fracking, when this technology was just coming in, and basically there were not a lot of workers who knew how to run this new set of equipment, especially in southwestern Pennsylvania. And there was a lot of teaming up with community colleges that really developed quite an adept local workforce for this. There's a related question here in the chat, in the Q&A stream, which is, I think, great. It's thinking out of the box on local policies. And it's saying, what about replacing current coal plants with nuclear power plants? So this is something that the questioner attributes to NASA climatologist James Hansen. One could think more broadly about other sorts of reuses of those facilities. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely something that people are discussing. It has some like technocratic reasons why it's nice, because those coal-fired power plants are already connected to the grid. And what is one of the things that our country is having a hard time with is hooking up new forms of energy to the grid. You're already wired in. So there's that piece there. I think we got to think very critically about what sorts of problems does that solution solve and which does it not, right? The skill set alignment, for some types of skills, you're going to get good alignment. For other types of skill alignment, perhaps less so, right? And so I think, there's lots of really good work that's being done by economists and others now on thinking about, where are those skill mappings present? And I think in any type of solution, nuke and coal being one of them, you got to think about, what problems does that solve? What problems does it not? I would also say just one last thing. One of the other things I like about solutions like that is that they are sources of local public finance. That is just to say local taxes for the community. And we got it. It's something that I don't think there's been enough attention to. Ironically, Gordon, I first met his work when he was doing work on public finance when I was writing my dissertation. Think about it. The state of Wyoming, 59% of the state budget comes from taxes on fossil fuel extraction. State of New Mexico, a huge chunk of their education budget. The local public finances of these places, when they have a coal-fired power plant shut down, it's not just the jobs, it's also the tax base. And that's something that the Salada Institute cluster research thing that I'm part of on communities is thinking a lot about. We're going to be teaming up with Gordon and the Reimagining the Economy to bring some experts in that area. But this public finance angle, which again, ironically, Gordon, teed up my interest in that 15 or I don't know, however many years ago. That's coming back full swing in a major way. And solutions like what the person said about nuke and a coal, it has those knock-on effects around public taxes as well, which is really great.
And of course, those facilities are, nuclear takes forever to build, has all these permitting problems. That's very expensive, but there's a lot of other possibilities given that these sites are connected right there, have the transmission distribution capacity. For example, using new methods for energy storage that could help balance grid needs with intermittency of renewables. Now, Gordon, if you want to jump in, but I have there's another interesting question in the chat stream. Unless Gordon, you want to jump in on this one?
No, let's move on to some new stuff.
Our colleague Bill Clark has a question here, and I'm going to read it. Bill is an esteemed senior colleague of ours who is an expert in sort of all things sustainability. Dustin's presentation stresses credibility. In my group's work on development assistance, we have found that it helps to unpack the terms. Specifically, the policy is more likely to be adopted if it is perceived to be credible, that is, it would work as promised, but also salient, that is, it is about what they see as the problem, not what you see as the problem. And it needs to be seen as legitimate, that is, actually advanced to promote their interests rather than someone else's. My sense is that Dustin's use of credibility encompasses all three of these. We found breaking them apart into saliency, credibility, and legitimacy helps to diagnose why a given policy is not supported. Thoughts?
Well, Bill,
this is an oral exam question here for you guys.
Yeah, it's my PhD. Well, I mean, Bill's of course has been a leader in this field for a long time, and my hat's out to all the work that he's done and is doing. Yeah, I agree. We do. I mean, in the book, I think more analytically say exactly where credibility starts and stops. But your points are very important. Legitimacy. I mean, that kind of you see this in the sort of community consultation, community partnership side of this. It's a crucial piece, and it's I showed the photo of a mural of coal workers, coal miners looking through this portal into an office space. And that actually came out of some work that we did interviewing some organizations that had this whole idea that we're going to turn coal miners into coders. And the sort of legitimacy of what that would be, what that future and what that lifestyle, there's just a disconnect there, right? And so, there has been successes in that space. But I think that that's an example of why legitimacy is so important. It's also, I'd say, Bill, these points about why we tried to go so ground up with this, and why what Gordon and his group has been doing with like literally bringing in people on the ground and listening. The workshop that I went to that he ran, Gordon didn't talk much. I didn't talk much. The other Harvard professors didn't talk much. We listened, and it was amazing. And I think that is a mechanism of generating legitimacy and then being able to work together and team up.
I just add super briefly that the insight in how to do this well is on the ground. One of the groups that came to that workshop that Dustin just mentioned, Coalfield Development, they have this very innovative program in which they help subsidize training for folks who are willing to put in 30 hours a week to training, internship, and advancing their careers, which is a major commitment, and do it over a sufficient period of time that they can leave with a credential that will get them a decent job. They're locally based. They've worked with local partners in figuring out what's the structure of the program that makes sense for the community that they're serving. You were to go to San Antonio, where we've dealt with another group working in workforce development. Their programs look different. They're trying to solve the same challenge. How do we help dislocated workers or disadvantaged youth get access to better jobs? But the particulars differ, and it's that local expertise that is essential for making it all work. And this is the optimistic part of this. In a very Tocquevillian sense, there are these organizations and associations and civic societies that are appearing to solve these problems, and we need to be doing more empowering them than micromanaging.
I just want to pause on that response just for a minute. There's a large amount of empirical literature dating back, my gosh, 30 years in the economics profession that really looks at what's often a pretty dismal record of job training programs in terms of really making a difference. And I want to stress for the audience that what you're saying is that we shouldn't just take that as a reason for despair, that perhaps reframing these programs or restructuring them or thinking about them in a more nuanced or local way could really make them far more effective than they've been in the past. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And the formula that folks have settled on is both intuitive and not super complicated. You provide workers with wraparound services, helping them imagine their careers and then choose the sort of sectoral training that makes most sense for them. And you involve employers in the design of the programs. That structure was proven first 25 years ago by an organization that the Kennedy School gave a medal to. And the head of that organization, Ernie Cortez, later won a MacArthur Genius Award for. The challenge is figuring out how to scale and replicate it. The federal government has been doing little of the scaling and replicating, and instead just kind of is giving out money in a similar formulaic manner since the most recent kind of vintage of worker training programs were put in place in the late 1990s. So the what to do is there. How to do it is the tough part.
That's incredibly helpful. I think this is a question from the chat stream for you, Dustin, which is how are we able to insulate government funding over a 10-year time span when government itself experiences fundamental changes every 4 years?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we do have mechanisms for this. Some of them are through more trust fund type things. That is one mechanism. A political scientist at Brown University, Eric Patashnik, is actually the world's sort of expert on these sorts of things. So I think, we do have mechanisms for this. Elements of the IRA very much sought to bake in some of these durability aspects through the tax code, right? So those are other things. But there are also like perverse, there are real challenges. And I'll give a quick story, which is the Black Lung Trust Fund. Okay, so this is a trust fund that was set up for coal miners who got black lungs disease. Horrible disease. You don't want to go out this way, folks, right? And for many, many years, basically it's funded by a tax on coal, okay? For many, many years, the federal government wouldn't adjust the rate, the per ton rate that they were charging to go into this fund to adjust for the fact that, inflation, people, right? One of the things that got Manchin to finally sign the RA is that they instituted basically an adjustment that would happen to drive money into the black coal trust fund in order to get him to sign. So that's great. But what's the problem still? The problem still is that it's fundamentally funded by a tax that's on the thing that we're also trying to get rid of, right? And so, this just illustrates, like, the question from the audience member is a great one. Yes, government turns over, right? There are mechanisms that we can use to deal with this, but even some of those mechanisms will have their challenges. And so we just have to be bright-eyed and clear-eyed about that, because these are fundamental challenges of political economy that we're dealing with. And, there's going to be no simple, easy solution. Otherwise, the economists, as they say, there's no $20 bill on the floor. We'd have already found it, and it's just not there.
Can you imagine a world in which, and I think, can you imagine a world in which we are actually not seeing declines in oil and gas communities? Coal communities are going to be declining, but oil and gas communities, since much of our oil and gas is something that we can export, and we're moderately low cost now, and some of the fracking oil and gas, so that these transitions are not particularly salient at the same time as developing widespread political support for the energy transition.
I'll let Gordon go first, then I've got an opinion.
So tough transitions come from the speed with which they're forced to happen. And if you want to try and move 6 to 10% of your labor force from one key export industry, and exporting meaning just selling outside of your community, to something else, that's hard to do. That's impossible to do in 5 years. It's hard to do in 10. More feasible to do over 20. So if we can do things not slowly, but not at the speed with which we expected, say, manufacturing communities to adjust to the rise of China or the advent of industrial robots, we have a much better prospect for success. And if we provide certainty in terms of the support that's going to be there to make those steps, as Dustin's been suggesting, then that certainty really helps resolve some of the investment challenges that are inherently part of this sort of problem.
Yeah, so for me, it's this fascinating question of pacing versus our other goals, right? And that's the ball game here. We can go fast because we say we need to solve the planet, and you're going to get all this backlash, which we are already seeing. We can go a little bit slower and do it in a way that creates predictability, it creates certainty, it creates a feeling of I'm not being left out by the elites in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C., and New York City. And we can start to make that transition, but that will be slower than what perhaps our planet needs. And that is this tension, right? And that is a tension that, you know what, like if you have the opportunity to speak with folks in the sorts of communities we're talking about, it's a great conversation, right? That they understand that climate change is happening, many, and but that is a fundamental tension. It's what my colleague Stephen Solberg says: how fast are we going to push on the gas pedal here? I mean, sort of irony in the analogy, and that's a deep question for our society to be struggling with, given that, just exporting oil, that's going to get burnt somewhere else, and that's going to have the same planetary effects, as Jim, you well know. So I think that's just a great thing for us to struggle around and think through and problem solve. And we can do that as a country, and we can do that as a world. I'm optimistic in that.
Well, thanks. This has just been a fascinating conversation. I think this is at the end here, especially, we're really touching on some absolutely critical or fundamental points about this, about forming the policy and transition. So thank you so much. Thank you both, Dustin and Gordon. This has just been a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate it. And let me thank you, the audience, for joining us tonight. I hope you're able to join us in January for our next installment. And until then, have a happy holiday season. And let me turn it over to our VPAL hosts.
Thank you, Dustin, Gordon, and Jim. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you'll join us for more signature events in 2024. Information about upcoming events, as well as recordings of past ones, can be found at vpal.harvard.edu/vpal-events. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.